Hello. My name's not the one they whisper about in family circles, at least not yet. They said they were protecting Aunt Miriam's legacy, but somehow that meant locking me out of decisions, rewriting the will, and letting strangers sit at her table while I stood outside. Worse than the betrayal was the slow, deliberate game. Meetings behind my back, portfolios shifted in silence, and a plan so carefully laid that by the time I saw it, the trap had already closed. How far would your own family go if what you stood to lose was everything? The late afternoon sun filtered through the maple leaves, scattering warm, dappled light across my sister's backyard. The smell of grilled burgers and ribs curled through the air, mingling with the crisp scent of early fall. I parked down the street, took a slow breath, and smoothed my shirt before heading toward the gathering. Family events had always been a blend of comfort and unease for me, like walking into a familiar room where you're never sure if the floorboards will creak. I spotted my sister Kelly near the grill with her husband Mark. She waved, her smile bright but just a fraction too polished, like she'd rehearsed it in the mirror. My parents sat at a picnic table under the big oak tree, my mother chatting animatedly with one of the neighbors, my father sipping iced tea in silence. Off to the side, leaning against the fence, was my cousin Drew, the one who had a way of lighting matches where there wasn't even smoke. "Hey, you made it," Kelly said, giving me a hug that was warm in form but cool in spirit. Her eyes darted toward the house before meeting mine again. I set my bag down on the bench near the patio and joined the group, exchanging hugs and hellos, trying not to overanalyze every tone of voice. We passed plates, poured drinks, and commented on the weather. It should have been ordinary, but there was something in the air, a kind of carefulness in the way people chose their words. It wasn't until I reached for my phone later that I noticed my bag was gone. My gaze swept the patio. Nothing. I stepped toward the house, and there it was, tucked behind a chair in the far corner like someone had tried to make it blend into the shadows. Drew was nearby, pretending to scroll on his phone, his smirk as casual as a misplaced comma. I didn't say anything, not yet. Back outside, I grabbed a drink from the cooler just as I caught a sound. A hushed exchange from the kitchen window left slightly open. Kelly's voice, low and urgent. "She can't know yet." My mother's reply was muffled, but the tone was sharp. Then the instant I stepped closer, silence. A pause too long to be coincidence. I stood there for a second, the glass sweating in my hand. Memories of other moments flashed, being left out of family discussions, hearing my name drop into conversations only for the topic to shift when I entered the room. When I returned to the table, I smiled, asked a few harmless questions, and listened to the polite answers. The clink of silverware, the fading daylight, the sizzle from the grill, all perfectly normal and all masking something that was not. My eyes scanned faces, watching for the smallest slip, a too quick glance, a forced laugh. I decided I wouldn't confront anyone tonight. Not yet. But I'd be watching and waiting. Because if there was one thing I'd learned, it's that people reveal themselves when they think no one is paying attention. Across the table, my mother and Kelly exchanged a look. It was fleeting, but it carried weight, like the opening note of a song you already knew would end badly. It wasn't what they said that unsettled me. It was what they didn't say. I eased myself out of the living room with a polite smile and a quick, "I'll just give you a hand in the kitchen." The laughter from the group behind me trailed off as I walked down the short hallway, the carpet soft under my feet, the faint hum of the refrigerator growing louder with each step. It felt good to have a moment away from the constant chatter and the half-watched football game on TV, but I wasn't there just to help with dishes. The kitchen smelled of grilled corn and apple pie. My sister stood at the sink, rinsing plates, her sleeves rolled to her elbows. Mom was beside her, stacking clean dishes into the drainer. Their conversation stopped when I stepped in, replaced by the clink of ceramic and the rush of warm water. I reached for a towel and began drying a plate, but my eyes kept flicking toward the narrow doorway that led to the pantry. That's when I heard the low murmur of voices, Mom's and someone else's I hadn't noticed before. Aunt Carol. Her voice was hushed, almost swallowed by the sound of running water, but a phrase cut through clear enough. "We need to decide before she finds out." My hands stilled, the towel bunched between my fingers. Mom's answer came, softer still. I caught the words "sooner the better" and "can't let it get messy." I strained to listen, the clink of a glass on the counter masking the rest. They didn't know I was there, or maybe they thought the noise of dishes would hide them. I turned my body just enough to see the reflection in the oven door. Mom and Aunt Carol standing close, heads tilted in, their expressions tight, deliberate. My name wasn't spoken, but I could feel it in the way their eyes darted toward the hall, then away. It wasn't paranoia. I'd felt this before, the sting of being the one left out of the real conversations. Before I could decide whether to step forward or stay put, the kitchen door swung open. My cousin Derek strolled in, a too bright grin on his face. "Hey, there you are," he said, as if he'd been looking for me. He leaned against the counter, crossing his arms casually. "So how's work? You still making good money?" It wasn't the question that set off alarm bells. It was the tone. Warm, overly so, the kind that in our family usually meant someone wanted something. I gave a measured smile. "Doing fine. Why?" He shrugged, glancing toward Mom and Aunt Carol before answering. "Just curious, you know. Family likes to keep up with each other." That wasn't true, and we both knew it. Memories slid in uninvited. The sudden check-in calls before someone asked for a loan. The feigned interest that dissolved the moment I said no. Derek's friendliness felt like a layer of wrapping paper, colorful but thin enough to see the shape of what was inside. I kept my tone light. "Well, I'm sure you'll hear if anything changes." He chuckled, though it didn't reach his eyes, and pushed off the counter. "Guess so." He left as quickly as he came, and I caught the quick, almost imperceptible glance he shared with Aunt Carol on his way out. The air in the kitchen felt heavier now, like the scent of something sweet turning sour. Mom busied herself with wiping the counter, not meeting my eyes. My sister kept stacking plates, her movements clipped. I wanted to ask what they were talking about, to demand the truth, but I bit it back. Too soon, and they'd shut down completely. Or worse, lie straight to my face. I placed the towel neatly on the counter and stepped toward the doorway. As I passed, I caught it. A brief exchange of looks between Mom and Aunt Carol, tight-lipped and knowing. Whatever they were hiding, they were running out of time to keep it from me. Morning light spilled across my desk in soft, uneven stripes, the blinds cutting the sun into neat little bars. I had been awake since before dawn, my mind looping the hushed words I'd caught in my sister's kitchen the night before. What to do before she finds out? I'd run those words forward, backward, sideways, trying to make them mean something harmless. They refused to cooperate. I brewed coffee strong enough to keep a trucker alert through Nebraska and sat at my home office desk, staring at the cursor blinking on my laptop screen. Work emails piled up, but my mind was elsewhere. My fingers drummed against the wood, restless, as if the truth might knock on my door if I waited long enough. It did, just not in the way I expected. Around 8:15, the mail carrier slid a small stack of envelopes through the slot. I sorted without thinking, utility bill, credit card statement, grocery coupons, until my eyes caught on one that made me pause. Thick, cream-colored paper. My mother's name on the front in looping, almost old-fashioned script. My address beneath it, neatly written as if that had always been her home, except it wasn't. The handwriting was familiar, though I couldn't place it. The return address in the corner was smudged, but the postmark told me it had come from a town less than an hour away. My pulse ticked up. This wasn't junk mail, and I doubted it was a birthday card. For a full minute, I just stared at it, weighing my options. Opening someone else's mail wasn't something I did lightly, but my family had already cracked the seal on my trust. If they were planning something that involved me without telling me, then this letter might be my only window in. I slid my thumb under the flap. The paper gave way with a soft tear. Inside was a typed letter, formal, businesslike. It outlined asset distribution before announcement. Paragraphs listed properties, accounts, and personal items. Names were assigned next to each entry. My mother's, my sister's, my cousin's, not mine, not once. And I read it again, slower this time, my jaw tightening. For years, I'd been told over and over that my parents believed in fairness, that whatever they had would be divided equally. because we're family and that's how we do things. It was a refrain I'd clung to, especially during those moments when I felt like the outsider. This document didn't just leave me out. It erased me entirely. The letter ended with a line that made my stomach knot. All changes to be finalized before she is aware, to avoid complications. My coffee had gone cold. I folded the letter along its crease and slid it back into the envelope. For a brief moment, I imagined walking into my mother's kitchen and slapping it down on the table, demanding an explanation. But if last night had taught me anything, it was that I needed to be smart. Confronting them now would only make them close ranks. So I hid the envelope in the bottom drawer of my desk, under a stack of old tax files. By the time I'd convinced myself to move on with my morning, the phone rang. "Hey, it's Derek." My cousin's voice came through, bright but too casual. "What's your schedule like this week? Any days you're not home?" I forced a smile he couldn't see. "Why do you ask?" "Just wondering if I could swing by, catch up." My grip on the phone tightened. "I'll let you know." We hung up and I sat there, staring at the silent phone. They were moving pieces on a board they thought I couldn't see. They were wrong. If they thought I'd stay quiet, they didn't know me at all. By that afternoon, the beginnings of a plan were already taking shape, one they would never see coming. I left the house with the misdelivered envelope tucked deep in my bag, its weight far heavier than paper and ink should allow. The restless pacing of my kitchen had done nothing to untangle the thoughts in my head, so I chose the one place where I could think clearly and still keep my back covered. Harold's coffee. Harold's had been on the corner for as long as I could remember, the kind of place where the air always smelled like freshly ground beans and warm pastries, and where every booth seemed to absorb secrets like a sponge. The door chimed as I pushed it open. Inside, the late morning light filtered through the windows in muted gold, dust motes drifting in the beams. I slid into the far corner booth, the one with the cushion that sagged just enough to make you lean back and notice every sound around you. I placed my bag beside me, resting one hand on it without thinking, as if someone might try to snatch it away. Harold himself shuffled past with a tray of mugs, giving me a nod. "Your usual?" I nodded back, my voice low. "Yes, thank you." I'd barely unwrapped my napkin when the bell over the door jingled again. I didn't even have to turn around to know who it was. The sudden shift in the air, the clipped sound of boots on tile, the faint scent of overly sweet perfume gave her away. Claire. She spotted me instantly, her eyes lighting up in a way that felt rehearsed. "Well, if it isn't my favorite cousin," she said, crossing the room before I could respond. She slid into the seat across from me without waiting for an invitation, peeling off her jacket with deliberate slowness. "I didn't know you came here," I said evenly. "Oh, just sometimes," she replied, glancing around as if she'd been caught in a lie. "Total coincidence running into you." Her smile was bright but strained, like a mask too tight for her face. We traded pleasantries, the weather, a vague comment about work, before she leaned forward, lowering her voice. "So, are you ready for the big news?" I lifted an eyebrow. "Big news?" Her mouth opened, then closed. "Oh, right. I guess you wouldn't have heard yet. It's just, family stuff." I sipped my coffee slowly, keeping my expression neutral. "Family stuff." She backpedaled with a laugh that didn't reach her eyes. "Nothing important. You'll find out soon enough." But her fingers drummed on the table, betraying a current of excitement. Or nerves. Then, as if she couldn't help herself, Claire said, "It's not like the distribution will take long. The amount's already in place. The 75. Split just the way Mom wanted. Shouldn't be more than a few weeks before it's official." 75. The number landed in my chest like a stone. I'd seen it just hours ago, typed neatly into the letter meant for my mother. The exact sum, the same quiet certainty that the process was already underway. I set my cup down carefully, making sure my hand didn't shake. "That's a very specific number." She froze for half a second, then forced another smile. "Oh, just an estimate I overheard." I didn't answer. Instead, I let the silence stretch, watching her shift in her seat, In my head, I weighed the satisfaction of calling her out now against the advantage of staying quiet. Silence won. When I finally slid out of the booth, I offered a polite smile. "Good seeing you, Claire." As I stepped outside, the cold air felt sharper against my skin. Something made me glance back through the coffee shop window. Claire was on her phone already, her head bent low, speaking fast, her eyes flicking toward the door I'd just walked through. They were moving pieces on the board. They just didn't know I'd learned how to play. By the time I reached my car, I knew exactly where I needed to go next, and who I needed to find. The afternoon sun was sharp, slicing through the thin veil of clouds and pooling in long, uneven streaks across the two-lane road that led to the edge of town. I had driven this way dozens of times before, usually without noticing the squat brick building that now seemed to pull at my attention like a magnet. Dalton's lock key had been there for decades. The paint on the sign was peeling, its once bold letters fading to a tired cream. A wind chime made of old brass keys tinkled in the faint breeze each time I pulled the handle on the door. The air inside was warm with the smell of oil, metal, and cedar, a scent that somehow reached into a corner of my memory I didn't know was still there. Behind a crowded counter of key blanks and neatly labeled drawers stood Mr. Dalton. His back was slightly bent, but his hands were steady as he set down the small file he'd been working with. He looked up and recognition lit his pale blue eyes. "Well," he said, his voice gravelly but warm, "you're his daughter." I didn't need to ask who he was. My father's shadow seemed to stretch even here, into this quiet little shop where the air was thick with things unsaid. "I am," I replied, offering a small smile. "I think you might have worked with him, years ago, on Willow Lane." He nodded slowly, gesturing toward the back of the shop. "Come on, no sense talking out here. Coffee?" I followed him past shelves of antique locks and dusty paperwork into a cramped back room. A battered percolator hissed on a side table, filling the space with the smell of strong, dark brew. "You've got his eyes," Mr. Dalton said, pouring 2 mugs. "Same way they'd go sharp when he was figuring something out." I wrapped my hands around the mug, letting the heat seep into my palms. "I've been trying to figure some things out lately, about the house, about that time." He leaned back in his chair, sighing. "That was a long time ago." But I remember it like yesterday. I stayed quiet, letting the silence invite the rest. "I was there to rekey the upstairs office," he began. "Your uncle said they were tightening security. Something about making sure certain people didn't get any ideas." He looked at me meaningfully. A shiver passed over my skin. "Certain people? Your father didn't say your name, but the way he and your uncle were going back and forth, it was about keeping control. He was angry, your uncle was worse. I remember thinking I'd walked in on something I shouldn't have." I took a slow sip of coffee. "Do you remember when that was?" Mr. Dalton frowned, tapping the side of his mug. "Late February. Might have been 09? Yes, because we had that ice storm. I had to salt my truck just to get it out of the driveway that morning." I froze. Late February 2009. That was months before the date my family had always claimed the decision was made about the property. According to them, it happened in summer after some big family discussion I hadn't been invited to. The air in the room thickened. "Are you sure about the date?" I asked. "As sure as I'm sitting here," he said. "I keep records. Got the invoice somewhere, if you want a copy." My pulse quickened. "I'd appreciate that." He disappeared into the front room for a moment, returning with a yellowed folder. Inside, neatly typed, was the service order. February 23, 2009. My father's signature. My uncle's initials. If they could change the dates, they could change the story. And if they could change the story, they could erase me from it entirely. I tucked the photocopy into my bag, my fingers brushing against the envelope I'd taken from my mailbox that morning. Pieces of the puzzle were starting to fit together, just not into the picture they'd been selling me all these years. As I left, Mr. Dalton called after me. "Be careful." They're not the type to let go of something once they've locked it down. The wind chime jingled again as I stepped out into the cold sunlight. I didn't have a full picture yet, but I had a new lead, and it was enough to keep moving. By the time I reached my car, I had already decided where I needed to go next, and who I needed to find. The sun was sliding lower in the sky by the time I pulled into the gravel lot outside Cedar Ridge Cemetery. The wrought iron gates stood half open, their black paint flaking in places, creaking faintly as the wind pushed through. I sat for a moment with my hands on the wheel, telling myself this was just about checking Dad's burial plot records. That was the excuse. The truth was folded neatly in my mind. A thread from Mr. Dalton's story that had led me straight here. The office was a squat brick building tucked behind a row of dogwoods. Inside, the air was still and faintly scented with old paper and furniture polish. A pendulum clock ticked with steady insistence from the far wall. Behind a polished oak counter sat Mrs. Keating, the cemetery's caretaker, late 60s, hair in a precise bun, glasses hanging from a beaded chain. She looked up, her voice soft but formal. "Afternoon, can I help you?" I gave her my rehearsed smile. "I'm looking to review the records for my father's plot. I just wanted to be sure everything's in order." She nodded without surprise, rising from her stool with a kind of deliberate grace. "We keep everything going back more than a century. Come with me." She led me down a narrow hallway into a side room lined with glass front cabinets. Inside, oversized ledgers sat in neat rows, their spines worn smooth by decades of handling. She selected one from the middle shelf and carried it to a long table, setting it down with a careful thud. "These will be the original purchase and maintenance records," she said, flipping to a section marked in faded ink. "Date of purchase, plot location, payments, and here," she tapped the far right column, "a notes section. We don't use that much anymore." The pages smelled faintly of dust and ink. As she turned them, my eye caught a swirl of handwriting in deep blue fountain pen. My pulse hitched. I'd seen those loops before, in old tax documents, in letters my father had signed when I was a teenager. Then my gaze snagged on a line that made my stomach tighten. 8 months before my father's so-called official property decision, there was an entry. Permanent maintenance. Plot 14B. But the payer's name wasn't my father's. It was my uncle's. I felt heat rise in my face. Mr. Dalton had been right. Whatever had been set in motion hadn't started when they claimed. It had begun much earlier, under a different name entirely. My family's story was unraveling, and the strands were older than I thought. Mrs. Keating moved to another cabinet, pulling out a second ledger for comparison. While her back was turned, I let my eyes travel to the far right column. In the notes section, written in the same blue ink, was a short instruction. "Hold for Mr. Lang until final papers." Mr. Lang. The name hit me like a small, cold stone dropped into deep water. I had never heard it spoken in our house, never seen it on a single document. Whoever he was, his name had been buried in this dusty book, waiting for someone to notice. I pulled my phone from my bag, shielding the screen with my hand as I snapped a quick photo of the page. The soundless click of the camera was loud in my ears. Mrs. Keating returned, setting down the second ledger with a sigh. "Everything looks current," she said, smoothing her skirt. I managed a smile. "Yes, thank you for your help." But my mind was already spinning. If Mr. Lang was real, he was either the key to the truth or the one who had locked it away. I stepped back into the cooling air, the photo secure in my phone, and one question pounding in my head. Who was Mr. Lang, and why was he worth hiding? The quiet hours after dinner have always been my most productive. The world outside my window softened into a wash of dusky blues, the hum of the fridge in the kitchen blending with the faint tick of the wall clock. I had pulled the blinds in my home office halfway down, leaving a ribbon of light from the street lamp outside. It felt private enough to dig where I wasn't supposed to. The probate court's online archive loaded slowly, the kind of government database that looked like it hadn't been updated since the early 2000s. I scrolled past familiar pages, the will's main provisions, the executor's letter, the obvious bequests. Then buried in an appendix, a phrase caught my eye: custodial trustee, Lang, Richard J. I leaned closer, rereading the clause. It applied to something labeled Minor Asset Category D4, an item no one had mentioned during the reading. Not my mother, not the lawyer, not even my father, when we spoke before the end. The name Lang felt heavier now, weighted with the same unease I'd felt holding that cemetery ledger. I printed the page, the hum of the inkjet sounding far too loud in the stillness. If Lang had been trusted with something in the will, it meant my father had involved him directly and deliberately kept it out of family conversations. 2 days after leaving the cemetery, I drove into Cedar Ridge's historic district. The Historical Society's brick building sat between an old post office and a diner that smelled like fried onions even from the curb. Inside, the air was cool and faintly sweet, like old paper and lemon polish. Behind the front desk, Mr. Heller looked up from a catalog card drawer, her wire-framed glasses slipping down her nose. "You must be the Bennett girl," she said warmly, using my maiden name the way people in this town always had. "What can I help you with?" I kept my tone casual. "I'm tracing some local donations, around the time the Veterans Memorial was restored." Her brow furrowed in thought. "That would have been maybe 12 years ago? Funny thing, there was a donor who insisted on being listed as anonymous, but I remember the check came from a Mr. Lang." The air shifted around me. "Lang?" I asked, pretending it was the first time I'd heard it. She nodded. "Polite fellow. Said he wasn't from around here, but he knew your father." She bent to unlock a storage cabinet, emerging with a stack of leather-bound albums. "We've got photos from the memorial dedication and the gala we held to fund it." The pages smelled faintly of dust and cologne as I flipped through them. Local officials, veterans in pressed uniforms, women in evening gowns. My eyes caught on one image and refused to let go. My father, in a dark suit, stood smiling, hand resting on the shoulder of a man I recognized instantly from no meeting I'd ever had. Square jaw, salt and pepper hair, the composure of someone used to making deals. Lang. But it was the third figure that made my pulse spike. To Lang's left, holding a champagne flute and laughing at something out of frame, was my cousin Elise. Elise, who swore she'd never heard the name Lang in her life. I closed the album gently, as if it might shatter. "Could I get a copy of this page?" I asked. Ms. Heller smiled. "Of course, dear." She carried the album to a back room, leaving me alone with the hum of the building's old ventilation system and the quiet thud of my heartbeat. I could see it now, the invisible threads binding my father, Lang, and Elise together. Threads they had worked very hard to keep me from noticing. When Miss Heller returned, she handed me a manila envelope. "Here you go, and if you think of any other history you're curious about, you know where to find me." I thanked her and stepped out into the cooling evening, the envelope under my arm. The street was nearly empty, the lamps casting long shadows on the cracked sidewalk. I didn't head straight to my car. Instead, I walked a slow circle around the block, letting the reality settle. If Elise lied about knowing him, she wasn't just protecting herself, she was protecting the same secret my father died keeping. The morning sunlight fell in soft stripes across my kitchen table, catching the steam from my coffee in a way that almost convinced me it was an ordinary day. I was halfway through my first sip when my phone buzzed. Elise. Her name lit up the screen like a warning flare. We hadn't spoken in weeks, not since the obligatory holiday dinner, but her voice now was all brightness and warmth. "Hey, I was thinking, coffee and catching up? My place?" I just pulled some cinnamon rolls out of the oven. The timing made my stomach tighten. Less than 24 hours had passed since I found that gala photo. My father, Mr. Lang, and Elise together, smiling as if the camera had caught something they all shared but never meant to explain. I forced my voice into casual territory. "Sure, give me 20 minutes. Elise's kitchen looked like a magazine spread, sunlight pouring through wide windows, a bowl of lemons on the counter, the smell of sugar and cinnamon hanging thick in the air. She hugged me as if we were just cousins catching up, no undercurrent, no unasked questions. We sat at her small round table and I waited for her to get to the point. Instead, she told me about her new yoga class, the dog she was thinking about adopting, and the veterans fundraiser she'd been volunteering for. "That's actually where I met Mr. Lang," she said, like it was an afterthought. Then, a blink too late, her eyes flicked to the window. My grip on the coffee mug tightened. "Funny," I said evenly. "I thought you told me you'd never met him." "Oh, well, it was barely meeting," she replied quickly, her tone breezy. "Just a hello at the registration table. He was a big donor, I guess." She took a bite of her roll, as if chewing could erase the slip. We moved on to talk about mutual acquaintances, but I kept my focus on her words, waiting. Eventually, she gave me what I needed. "That fundraiser was in March," she said. "Cold as anything. I wore that awful green coat Aunt Miriam gave me." I nodded, though my mind was already running the math, March. But the trust account change linked to Mr. Lang had been dated in February, and Elise had been in the same city that week. She'd told me she was there for a work conference. She'd just given herself away. The gala hadn't been their introduction. It had been a public cover for something that had happened before. When I stood to leave, she walked me to the door, smiling as if we'd spent the morning talking about nothing more than family gossip. "Don't be a stranger," she said. In my car, I let out the breath I'd been holding. The February date echoed in my head louder than anything else she'd said. If she'd lied about when she met him, she was lying about why. She thought she'd hidden the truth in plain sight, but her smile didn't erase the sound of February echoing in my head. Early afternoon sunlight cut across my desk in long, thin bars, the blinds throwing prison stripes over the padded envelope sitting dead center. No return address. Postmarked from 2 towns over. I turned it over twice before slicing it open. Inside was a single sheet of thick paper, folded in half. The Veterans Hall letterhead was unmistakable. Deep navy ink, the eagle crest faintly embossed at the top. Below, neatly typed, was the guest list from the fundraiser Elise had mentioned. Seat numbers ran in precise columns, each table laid out like a map. Halfway down, my eyes froze. Table 4, Seat 4B, Mr. Lang, Seat 4C, Elise Merriman, directly across from one another. Her "oh, I just bumped into him" story shattered in an instant. Someone had seated them together on purpose. I sat back, holding the page in both hands like it might burn me. Whoever had sent this wanted me to see it, but not to know who they were. I dialed the Veterans Hall. Harold answered on the second ring, his voice warm but wary. "Harold, it's me. I got something in the mail. A guest list from the fundraiser. I need to know if it's real." A pause. "That list isn't supposed to leave the hall." "I understand," I said, steady. "But this is about family, and I can't explain more over the phone." He exhaled sharply. "Come by this afternoon. Back entrance." The hall smelled of polished wood and old coffee. Harold met me in a small office tucked behind the main room, closing the door with a soft click. His salt and pepper hair curled over his collar, and his eyes carried that mix of friendliness and discretion he'd perfected over decades. "This the one?" He glanced at the paper in my hand. I slid it across. He adjusted his glasses, nodded once. "It's genuine, and I remember that table. Lang and your cousin, Elise, right? Spent most of the night leaning in, talking low. Barely touched their food." The image lodged in my mind, their heads close together, conspiring over candlelight. I scanned the list again, my finger tracing down to a name near the bottom, Leonard Pierce. It hit like a quiet alarm bell. Aunt Miriam's financial advisor. The man who'd managed her accounts for years. "You remember him?" I asked. Harold shrugged. "Didn't talk much, but I did notice him keeping an eye on your cousin from across the room. Like he was waiting for something. So it wasn't just Elise and Lang. Pierce was there too, and if Pierce was involved, Aunt Miriam was closer to this than I'd imagined." I left with a photocopy folded neatly in my bag. On the drive home, my phone buzzed. Aunt Miriam's name lit the screen. "Well, hello, dear," she said, her voice light. "What have you been up to?" I kept my tone even. "Just sorting through some old things. You know how it is." A small hum on her end, the kind you make when you're fishing for more. I gave her nothing. By the time I pulled into my driveway, I'd made up my mind. Pierce's name wasn't staying on paper. I'd find his recent transactions, his meeting records, every trace he'd left in the past year. Because every name on that list was a breadcrumb. And now I knew. The trail didn't end with Elise. Late morning sunlight spilled across my desk, catching the edge of the Veterans Hall guest list I'd been poring over all night. The name, Leonard Pierce, had stayed in my mind like a stubborn echo. Aunt Miriam's financial advisor, Elise's possible co-conspirator. I dialed the number I found on his firm's website, forcing my voice into a bright, neutral tone. "Hi, this is Rachel Holden. I was wondering if Mr. Pierce might have a few minutes today to discuss some investment options." The receptionist's voice was efficient, practiced. "Let me see. We had a cancellation at 11:30. Would you be able to come in then?" "Yes," I said without hesitation. "I'll be there." It felt too easy, like a door opening that should have been locked, but I knew better than to look a gift horse in the mouth. By the time I reached downtown Springfield, the day had turned crisp and bright, the kind that makes the glass and steel buildings gleam. Pierce's office occupied the 15th floor of a polished mid-century high-rise. Inside, the waiting area smelled faintly of leather and cedar. A receptionist in a navy sheath dress greeted me with a smile that didn't reach her eyes. "Mr. Pierce will be with you shortly," she said, offering a glass of water. When he emerged, Leonard Pierce looked exactly like the type who could coax someone into signing away their fortune. Tall, perfectly groomed, with a handshake firm enough to project confidence, but not so firm as to intimidate. His suit was charcoal, his tie understated silk. "Ms. Holden," he said warmly, then paused just a fraction too long. "Come in." The office was the kind of understated luxury that spoke in whispers rather than shouts. Mahogany desk, leather-bound ledgers, framed certificates from universities and finance boards. But it was the glass case on the sideboard that caught my attention. A folded American flag with a brass plaque, alongside a photo of Pierce in uniform shaking hands with someone I couldn't quite place. He saw my eyes flick toward it. "Marine Corps," he said simply. I nodded, filing it away. My father was Army. Something shifted in his posture, not warmth exactly, but recognition. We spent the first 15 minutes discussing conservative investment strategies, municipal bonds, and projected yields. I let him talk, offering polite nods, watching how his gaze never lingered too long in one place. When there was a natural lull, I said casually, "I heard you were at the Veterans fundraiser earlier this year. My cousin Elise mentioned she volunteered." For the briefest second, his eyes darted away, the kind of involuntary flicker most people would miss. "Ah yes, the fundraiser," he said. "A fine event." "She said she met you there," I replied lightly, tracing the rim of my water glass with a fingertip. His mouth curved into a polite smile. "Well, when I first met her in early February." He stopped, corrected. "I mean, before the fundraiser. We'd spoken about some preliminary matters. Mutually beneficial, you could say." There it was. He hadn't just met Elise at the gala. Their connection went back weeks earlier, well before the trust's minor asset category had been quietly reassigned. Pierce leaned back in his chair, steepling his fingers. "You know, Ms. Holden, in my profession, timing is everything. Sometimes portfolios need to be adjusted quietly to protect interests before certain public announcements. It's about staying ahead of the current, not chasing it." The words were delivered like generic financial wisdom, but the weight in them was unmistakable. Protect interests before public announcements. I thought of Aunt Miriam's holdings, stable, predictable, and how an unrecorded shift could funnel value elsewhere without the rest of the family knowing. Elise's smirk at the last reunion replayed in my mind like a loop. I smiled faintly, tucking my notes back into my bag. "That's an interesting perspective, Mr. Pierce." He rose, offering his hand again. Always a pleasure to discuss strategy. The elevator doors closed around me, the hum of the cables masking my thoughts. If Pierce was telling the truth, Elise's plan had been in motion long before any of us saw it coming. And the more I learned, the more it felt like the floor beneath our family was shifting. Not in one sudden jolt, but in a series of small, deliberate tremors. the kind that only show their damage once the walls start to crack. Elise called just before noon, her voice light but deliberate. "We need to clear the air," she said. "Lunch? My treat." I let a pause stretch, just long enough for her to notice. "Sure," I replied, keeping my tone neutral. An unexpected olive branch from Elise was never without thorns, and I wanted to see exactly where she intended to stick them. The cafe she chose sat 2 blocks from the courthouse. Quiet, upscale, the kind of place where lawyers met clients over kale salads. Inside, low amber light softened the edges of polished wood tables. A faint hum of conversation floated under the soft clink of silverware. She was already there, waving from a corner booth, the one with a perfect view of the entrance. She slid into her seat only after I sat down, leaving me with my back to the wall. A tactical choice. We started with small talk, weather, her latest charity brunch, Aunt Miriam's unshakable spirit. But it didn't take long for her to pivot. "I've been thinking about the family," she began, folding her hands over her water glass. "About how to protect what's left." Her gaze held mine, her tone warm enough to mask the steel beneath. "Elise," I said evenly, "protecting the family doesn't mean cutting them out of decisions." She leaned in, lowering her voice. "This isn't about cutting anyone out. It's about stopping the bleeding. You've been stirring things up." "We can't afford any more damage." The words slid into place, meant to sound like concern, but loaded with accusation. "You're calling this lunch to tell me to back off?" I asked. She smiled, almost pityingly. "Think of it as an intervention." I sipped my coffee, letting the bitterness anchor me. "And if I don't?" Her smile thinned. "Then you'll only make it harder for the rest of us." We danced in polite circles for another 10 minutes before it happened, the slip I'd been waiting for. "You know," she said, swirling her straw in her iced tea, "Leonard Pierce spoke highly of you after your first meeting." The words landed like a match in dry grass. My first meeting with Pierce had been yesterday. The only way she could reference it, and call it the first, was if she knew about the other one, the preliminary meeting he'd admitted to, with her. I didn't flinch, didn't let her see the satisfaction flicker in my chest. "Did he?" I asked, my tone breezy. "That's nice to hear." Inside, the pieces locked into place. She had orchestrated it from the start. We lingered a few more minutes, Elise chattering about a museum fundraiser next month as if she hadn't just confirmed my suspicions. I paid my share, thanked her, and stepped into the daylight. If Elise thought trapping me over coffee would scare me off, she'd miscalculated. She'd just given me the one thing I needed most. Proof. Morning at the Greene County Courthouse began with a damp chill. I arrived early, a thin folder tucked against my ribs. Elise swept in 10 minutes later, a shade paler than usual, Leonard Pierce one step behind her. When the clerk called our case, I stood, palms dry, pulse even. The months of tiptoeing were over. Judge Harris read the docket, glanced at both tables, and asked whether there were any new evidentiary items to consider. "Yes, Your Honor," I said. "A digital recording obtained during a voluntary lunch meeting yesterday afternoon." Elise's head snapped toward me. I described the setting, the date, the time, the device, and the chain of custody. My aunt's former attorney, now my ally, rose to confirm that he had received the file, verified its metadata, and prepared a certified transcript. Judge Harris nodded once, the signal to proceed. We played the recording for the court. The audio filled the room, clatter of dishes, low cafe music, our voices threaded through. We reached the part where Elise tried to frame the meeting as an intervention, an act of mercy for a sister who didn't understand how complicated legacy can be. Then the slip, casual as a sigh. "Leonard spoke highly of you after your first meeting." She said it like weather, not knowing it was thunder. Judge Harris leaned forward. He asked Elise to confirm the date of her first contact with Mr. Pierce. She began to answer, stopped, looked at Leonard. He went gray around the mouth. Their attorney asked for a brief recess. Denied. My counsel approached the lectern again, laying out the lattice we had built. The misdelivered envelope addressed to my mother. The typed letter outlining asset distribution with my name erased. Mr. Dalton's invoice dates from the old house on Willow Lane. the cemetery ledger noting a payment by my uncle months before the so-called official decision, the will excerpt naming Mr. Lang as custodial trustee, the veterans gala photo with my father, Mr. Lang, and Elise. Leonard swallowed. Those were exploratory conversations, he said, nothing improper. Judge Harris tapped the edge of the bench with his pen. Exploratory conversations are not at issue. Misrepresentation to this court is. The petition rests on claims of transparency and good faith. The record suggests otherwise. Elise's composure cracked. I watched the fear flicker behind her eyes, a lighthouse beam sweeping a ruined shoreline. She rose to speak and managed only, "This is a misunderstanding," before her voice thinned. The judge exhaled through his nose, patient but stern. "Petition dismissed with prejudice," he said. "The court will not be used as a stage for private power plays. Counsel for Ms. Hayes," he nodded toward me, "may submit a motion for fees. I advise all parties to consider carefully their next steps outside this courtroom." A rustle moved through the gallery. Leonard sat. Elise didn't. She stared at me as if I had spoken her own language against her. Outside, reporters clustered on the steps. I kept my remarks short. I said the truth carries better than a lie. I said families heal when we stop rewriting history. I thanked the court and the community. I did not mention revenge. I did not need to. By late afternoon, the headlines read, "Petition dissolved, timeline exposed." Elise's lawyer called it a misunderstanding. I went home, washed my face, and called Aunt Miriam's former attorney to thank him. He chuckled softly. "Your father would be proud of how you built the case," he said. "Quiet work isn't invisible when the lights finally come up." That evening's charity gala hummed with silverware. I'd confirmed my attendance weeks ago. Elise had too. The room cooled when she approached. Days earlier, I had placed 3 quiet calls. One to the chair of the hospital board, who once pulled me aside to say he'd admired the grants I wrote back when my name was left off the press release. One to the editor of the gala program, a woman who remembered my late father setting out chairs when volunteers ran thin. And one to the director of the reading clinic saved by those grants. I didn't tell them what to do. I gave them what they needed: context, receipts, consistency. I told them the court would handle the law, communities handle the rest. Elise arrived in a dress the color of snowfall. She smiled with the right amount of teeth. She air-kissed the right cheeks, but the ripples had already moved ahead of her. 2 board members shifted away when she drew near. A patron nodded, then greeted me with a warmth he'd never shown in public. People quietly turned away. During the silent auction, the program director thanked legacy donors by name. When she reached Aunt Miriam's line, she paused. "And to Miriam's niece," she said, looking at me, "whose diligence behind the scenes helped save the reading clinic in its hardest year, thank you." Applause rose from one side of the room. Elise's smile didn't falter, but something in it slipped, as if a thread had finally snapped. Near dessert, I caught Leonard at the edge of the ballroom speaking too quickly to a man from the bank. He stopped when he saw me, his face softening into the kind of apology that arrives only after impact. "This wasn't supposed to happen like this," he said. "I'm sure it wasn't," I answered. "But it happened the way it needed to." He looked past me toward Elise, alone under a chandelier, watching donors who no longer rotated around her. For the first time, I felt a thin pity for him. I didn't gloat. The whispers moved on their own. My only deliberate act was a quiet conversation with the program director in a hallway that smelled of steam and dish soap. We agreed to create a new community advisory seat for the reading clinic, chosen by the frontline tutors who live the mission. When she asked what it should be called, I said, "The Willow Seat." She nodded, relieved. I left before the final toast. The night air made me walk slower. At home, I set my bag down and took Aunt Miriam's ring from its little velvet box. It had belonged to her mother, and then to her, waiting in a drawer until I claimed the part of my family that hadn't tried to erase me. I placed the ring on the mantel and stood back in the quiet house. I thought about my father's photo, the invoices, the ledger, the gala, and that lunch where someone mistook control for mercy. I thought about the people who had helped me, quietly, because they recognized the sound of someone telling the truth even when it wasn't fashionable. The phone buzzed. A message from the hospital board chair. Well done today. When you're ready, we'd value your voice on the grants committee. Another from the program editor. I'm glad the right name is finally on the right work. And one more, unexpected, from my mother. I need time. But I saw what I needed to see. I sat on the sofa, legs tucked beneath me the way I used to sit when I wanted to disappear. That girl had learned how to listen. The woman she became learned when to speak. I didn't win everything. Some papers will never be corrected, some chairs will stay empty, but I won back the ground beneath my own feet. I won the right to say clearly where I had stood all along. Tomorrow there will be errands and laundry and a pile of mail. There will be people who look away and people who look directly at me. There will be small kindnesses, which are how lives are built when scaffolds collapse. I turned off the lamp and let the room go soft around the edges. The ring on the mantel caught a slice of streetlight and threw it back, a thin, bright line on old metal. It looked like a ruler across the page. I didn't just survive their game. I rewrote the rules, and I made sure they could never play it again. Looking back, I realized this fight was never just about winning in court. It was about reclaiming my voice, my dignity, and the truth my family tried to bury. In life, people will sometimes underestimate you, rewrite your story, or play games with what's rightfully yours. But strength isn't always loud. Sometimes it's built quietly, piece by piece, until the moment you choose to stand up and speak. When you do, the truth has a way of cutting through every lie. If you take anything from my journey, let it be this. You are allowed to protect what matters to you. You are allowed to draw boundaries, to demand respect, and to walk away from people who profit off your silence. And when the world tries to tell you to sit down, that's often the clearest sign you should stand taller. Now I want to hear from you. Have you ever had to fight for something that was yours, even when the odds felt stacked against you? Drop your story in the comments. If this video touched your heart, comment 1 or share where you're watching from. If it didn't resonate, tell me why. Your honesty matters here. And if you haven't already, hit that subscribe button so you don't miss the next story. You never know. The next one might be the spark you need.